In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Veni Sancte Spiritus repletuorum corda fidelium et tui amoris in eis signum accende. Emite Spiritum tuum et creabuntur. Oremus Deus qui corda fidelium Sancti Spiritus illustratione docuisti dano missioniorem Spiritu recta sapere et de eius semper consolatione gaudere per Christum Dominum nostrum. Sedes sapientiae. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti. Amen. Anybody tired today? Like I noticed 3 people falling asleep yesterday. And if you think this is boring, you haven't seen the detail that we could go into. I'm really trying to take the most interesting parts. So if you find this boring, which I don't see how that's possible, but if you do, then keep in mind that it could be even more boring. So if you happen to find it that way, which I know some people just don't like history, but this could be a lot more detailed than it is. All right, so back to Luther's odd ideas on celibacy. So, of course, all of the fathers of the church are very much in favor of celibacy, the observance of the virtue of chastity, or even taking the vow of chastity. And as a result, they found little favor with Luther when they require of the clergy, of monks and nuns, not merely the observance of celibacy, but also the use of the means enjoined by asceticism for the preservation of that virtue. So, again, Luther having this idea that it's impossible to resist the movements of the passions. He thinks that this is part of his new gospel. So, therefore, the fathers of the church are also wrong when they say that it is not only possible but necessary to overcome the lower passions, the movements of concupiscence, and that therefore we have to do everything that lies in our part to do it, which includes taking advantage of means of mortification. So that doesn't sit well with Luther. Remember, he sees himself as essentially the only infallible person in the world. Or at least the primary infallible person in the world. He's replaced himself for the Pope. He's put himself in the place of the Pope, has arrogated papal authority essentially to himself, personal infallibility. And so the fathers of the church disagree with Luther, therefore they must be wrong. That's how it works in his mind at this point. And of course, he's not going to like it. He doesn't like it when they say that they make known their preference, the fathers of the church make known their preference for the vow of chastity, though even without by any means disparaging marriage. Of course, they're all going to say that marriage is in itself a good state, that those who are suited to that rather than to the religious life or the clerical life do nothing wrong. They certainly don't sin in embracing the married life. It is a good state in itself. But, of course, they're going to say that the state of celibacy is higher, that it is more excellent to observe celibacy for the correct motives, and, of course, to take a vow of chastity is greatly meritorious. And, of course, everything being done with the correct motives. But considered in itself, the state of virginity is higher than the married state. That's actually even de fide, certainly defined by the Council of Trent, which of course hasn't happened yet, but of course it was always true. And Luther does not like the fact that the fathers of the church insist on that point. So the fathers of the church quote what our Lord had said on this doctrine, he that can take it, let him take it. So he who is able to observe the virtue of chastity perfectly ought to do so, or it's better that he do so. It's more meritorious. It's a more excellent state. Of course, the fathers of the church, in the spirit of St. Paul, as one who who, as one having obtained the mercy of the Lord, joyfully acquiesced in his counsel of chastity. Because that's exactly what it is. The observance, the perfect observance of chastity is a counsel. And of course, everybody has to observe the virtue of chastity to the degree required by his state in life, but to observe it perfectly is a counsel and is most excellent. So, of course, read the Fathers, they very clearly advocate the doctrine of holy continence. But then Luther, according to his ideas, asks the question of what use were their penitential practices for their preservation of their chastity, since they themselves allow that they were constantly troubled by temptations of the flesh. Because in Luther's mind, the attacks of sensuality, so the movements of concupiscence, of carnal man, the enduring sense of our concupiscence are sins already. Which makes sense if you have the idea that you can't control any of it. You suffer those movements, you're bound to sin. He's come to the conclusion that even just to experience, even just a temptation, is already a sin. So yes, of course, everybody has to fight or deal with concupiscence. Everyone has to deal with the movements of the lower passions, but it's not to merely be tempted is not a sin. But Luther again takes exception to that, and he considers himself infallible, so he must be right. So I'll put Luther on hold here for a moment, and I'll look at some of the other things that were going on during the reign of Pope Adrian VI, because we are continuing the study of his reign, which was rather short, but not completely devoid of, we've seen momentous events. His pastoral care was not confined to the provinces of Catholic Europe, which is still at this time, generally speaking, Catholic. So we have Luther causing trouble, but the continent as a whole is still Catholic. So hearing that missionaries were needed in America, he sent to the New World a body of Franciscan religious for the propagation of the faith. To encourage these apostles, he gave them proof of his confidence and apostolic solicitude by a pontifical bull directing that in the Indies, by which name the whole of the New World was known at the time, wherever there existed no episcopal see, or in those places which the bishops or their vicars could not easily visit, the episcopal jurisdiction might be exercised by religious, especially delegated by the superiors for that purpose, except in those cases in which the episcopal character was absolutely indispensable. So he's making things as easy as possible for these missionaries to do their work in areas in which the ecclesiastical hierarchy clearly has not been either well established or even established at all. And of course, it's not saying that he's not giving priests the ability to ordain or anything like that. That's clearly impossible, but he's giving them certain ability to do certain acts of jurisdiction that would usually be reserved to the bishop of a diocese, but which, given the vast territories that they had to cover, especially the speed of communications at the time, giving them the ability to carry out certain acts of jurisdiction like that will make their jobs considerably easier. Not easy in themselves, obviously. This is the work, missionary work is never an easy thing, but helps them to a considerable extent. So while Germany harbored a rebellious monk whose fanatical declamations against the doctrines of free will, the efficacy of good works, the sacraments, and the spiritual and temporal power were undermining every moral, religious, and social principle, God raised up in Italy several apostolic men whose zeal and whose example rekindled in the hearts of both clergy and faithful a love of piety, pure morality, and the practice of every virtue. So there are still saints in the world. Luther's shadow is not so great as to eliminate the possibility of there being saints. Even great saints, saints who have been canonized by the church and who have places on the calendar. So there was Saint Cajetan of Tiana, of the illustrious Italian family. In Rome, there was Saint Jerome of Vicenza, who founded the order of the Theatines. Let's see. So, and they were called the Theatines because of the diocese in which they were first founded, and the Diocese of Chieti, which is a name which is in a different name for, I think the variation is Tieta or something like that. So Chieti, it's the same place. In fact, their first general was Peter Carafa, who was the archbishop of that city. He retained his title, but it was founded in his diocese, and that's why they're called the Theatines. So the chief ends of the Theatine order were to preach to the people, to assist the sick, to oppose errors in faith, which of course there's need of that, especially this time, to restore among the laity the frequent and devout use of the sacraments, and among the clergy a spirit of disinterestedness, regularity and fervor, a love for sacred studies, the most religious respect for holy things, and a strict ecclesiastical discipline. So all things which, if they had been more widespread, could have prevented either the rise of Luther or at least prevented him from having much of an impact. So perhaps this effort is a little bit late, but efforts like it could have conceivably prevented Luther's revolution. There's also Saint Jerome Emiliani, a noble Venetian, who was at the same time engaged in erecting charitable institutions in all the cities of Lombardy. So it's St. Jerome Emiliani. He endowed numerous hospitals and became has been compared to a St. Francis of Paula of the 16th century. And at Somasca, which was a village on the frontiers of Venetian territory, he founded a congregation which was named, because of the place of origin, the Congregation of the Somasques. So the members of this order devoted themselves to the instruction of the youth, and especially of young men destined for the ministry of the altar. So giving people a seminary training of sorts. A similar institution was established at Milan by 3 noblemen, which became known as the Barnabite order, from the Church of St. Barnabas, which was assigned to their use. And then, of course, though, holiness and good works were not confined to Italy. Other examples were in Spain. There was an old soldier who had been born a shepherd, who by the force of his example, the founder of an order of charity, which has spread throughout the world, was established. And that's St. John of God. So here's in Italy. You have, besides him, in this period, St. John of God in Spain. He had been led to his change of life by the saintly eloquence of Father John Davila, who was known as the Apostle of Andalusia. So it was under the direction of this particular priest that St. John of God began to gather the sick and the poor into his own dwelling, which was a modest dwelling, where he served them and provided for their wants with zeal and charity, which attracted universal admiration. And of course, his example spread. The Archbishop of Granada sent for him once and told him that he was charged with receiving vagabonds and persons of bad character. Whereupon he threw himself at the feet of the Archbishop and replied, "The Son of God came to save sinners. We are obliged also to promote their conversion by our sighs, our tears, and exhortations. I am unfaithful to my vocation because I neglect this duty, And I acknowledge that I know no other bad person in my hospital but myself, who am a most wretched sinner, unworthy to eat the bread of the poor. So, some things only saints could get away with. Saying things like that is one of them. So he was joined by some pious imitators, and thereby began the Order of Charity, otherwise known as the Order of the Brothers of St. John of God, known in Italy as the Fate Ben Fratelli. And then, another progeny of holiness and penance was at the same period given to the world by the Order of St. Francis, in the person of St. Peter of Alcantara. He was distinguished among religious by the practice of the greatest humiliations, most rigorous fasts, incredible watchings, and painful austerities. And actually, we had his feast recently. The constant union of his soul with God suffered no interruption from any external employment. He told St. Teresa that he once lived in a house 3 years without knowing any of his religious brethren except by the sound of their voices. So an extraordinary example of custody of the eyes. He didn't even know what the others looked like. So clearly then he had a love of retirement, and he begged his superiors that he might be placed in some solitary convent where he could give himself up to the practice of contemplation. His wish was granted, and it was in that retreat that he composed his golden book on mental prayer, which was deemed a masterpiece by St. Teresa, by the famous author Louis of Granada, by St. Francis de Sales, Pope Gregory XV, as well as others. So he's got quite a few credible approbations. His work was followed by another treatise on the peace of the soul, or an interior life, in which he lays down the rules of the contemplative life and of the highest perfection. After a long practice of the severest austerities of penance, he drew up the plan of a religious order, which would follow the rule of St. Francis in all its primitive rigor. The religious who embraced this institute were called the Discalced Carmelites, or of the strict observance of St. Peter of Alcantara. And of course, this was a movement that was very much embraced by St. Teresa of Avila. So later on, while he was in charge of the spiritual direction of St. Teresa, that he encouraged her in her project of reforming the Carmelite order along the same lines. So again, he did this for the Franciscans, she did it for the Carmelites. So it was a general movement that she embraced, even though it wasn't in the same order. He supported her through the troubles and obstacles of every description against which she had to struggle in accomplishing the will of God. So if you want more details on that, you can read the book that we had read last year about her. And there's also the film on her life, which is supposed to be very accurate, that illustrates all of the troubles that she had in pursuing this reform. Then also the Order of Ursuline Nuns was established around the same time by St. Angela de Merici of Brescia for the virtuous education of young ladies, and was soon spread over all Catholic Europe, winning universal esteem by the virtue and fidelity of its members to their duty. So that was the interior life of the Catholic Church at the beginning of the 16th century. I mean, it's of course much more edifying to consider than the blasphemous calumnies that Luther and his people poured out against it. Again, that's really all that we just talked about is really more of the history of the church than things like Luther. Again, because in these church history classes, we focus really primarily on the conflicts of the history of the church. It's really an apologetics class. You learn things here that you would use in arguing with people, essentially. All the rest, the stories of the lives of the saints, etc., is it's excellent sermon material, but it's not something that you're going to have to employ in arguing with Protestants too much, except perhaps to illustrate the holiness of to be found in the lives of members of the Catholic Church, as opposed to among Protestants of various stripes or other sects. There's no holiness of life to be found among those people, as we've seen, as we will see. And in fact, we'll see very soon why exactly they're called Protestants. And there's a hint, it's not because they were known for tolerance, which is so much extolled today. The original Protestants had no use for that, as we'll see. So that's a summary of the events of the reign of Pope Adrian VI. And now we'll go on to Pope Clement VII, whose reign is also highly momentous, mainly for bad reasons. Another Medici Pope. His dates are November 19th, 1523, to September 25th, 1534. So, a reign of 11 years, which is, compared to some of the other popes, we've seen quite long. But again, not marked for any, mainly not for good events. It's not to say, of course, that the life of the church didn't continue under his reign, that there weren't edifying saints doing edifying work during his reign, but you think of events like the Schism of Henry VIII when you think of Pope Clement VII. That's one of the things he's famous for, is for dealing with Henry VIII. Which is interesting, really, that he was as firm as he was in dealing with the likes of people like that. You'd think that a Medici Pope would be weak and would give way, but he didn't. Yeah, but we've yet to see that. So at the death of Pope Adrian VI, Giulio de' Medici, a cousin of Leo X, so see, another Medici, was raised to the pontifical throne. And doubtless his position was a difficult one, so he inherited all the problems of all of the reigns of the popes immediately preceding. So our author says, quite rightly, that God had heavy trials in store for the soul of this particular pontiff. Italy was cruelly scourged by war. The Reformation was making daily progress. There was another assembly at Nuremberg in 1524 with unmistakable evidences of sympathy for Luther's novelties. The papal nuncio there was a man of determined will and an able theologian. He had perceived the hostile stand of the majority and could only oppose the decisions of that particular diet with protestations which were unheeded. So his protestations against the Protestants didn't go so well, which is not really surprising, given the state of how much sympathy there was for Luther in Germany at the time. So the Catholic princes of Germany were starting to band together in favor of their own interests. Three of these, the Duke Wilhelm, Duke Louis of Bavaria, and Ferdinand, Archduke of Austria, met at Ratisbon, where they were soon joined by several bishops and archbishops. They concluded a treaty for the defense of Catholic doctrine and worship against Lutheranism. So there was actually some movement against the revolution, but we'll see, not enough to stem it completely. So a lot of the princes are in favor of Luther, but some are actually opposing him. Perhaps some of them have come to their senses and realized that all of this heresy is actually going to work against them. which they should have seen from the start, but apparently they didn't. Since the year 1521, so 2 years before Clement VII's election, Italy had been a battlefield on which Emperor Charles V and King Francis I of France contended for the empire of the world. Clement VII was alarmed by the growing power of Charles and thought it his duty, or at least in his interest, to favor the cause of his opponent. So there was a particular nobleman, the Duke of Bourbon, who was French, who was advancing in Italy with a reinforcement of 12,000 Germans, which he had levied at his own expense. Ordinary prudence would have required the French, because Francis himself was in Italy at the time with his own army, he should have retreated from this force that was advancing against him, but he considered it that it would have been a disgrace to fly before this man who was a traitor. He saw it, and was fighting against his king. So he determined to wait for his approach, but ended up suffering a very lamentable defeat for the arms of France. And the king himself was made a prisoner after the battle. So this thing, the royal prisoner, was because in fighting this battle was fought or really won by those who were on the side of Charles V, Emperor Charles V. He was taken to Madrid and only obtained his release after signing a treaty by which he renounced all claims upon Italy, gave up the Duchy of Burgundy to the empire, and promised to deliver his 2 eldest sons as hostages for the performance of these conditions, to return the estates and rights to the Duke of Bourbon, and to bind himself by a matrimonial alliance to the family of Charles. So, Charles V enacted very demanding conditions in order for before he would release King Francis, but the King of France had no intention of actually abiding by any of that. Again, a lot of this is not something that I would really test you on, but it is necessary to understand this, what we're going over right now, in order to understand what leads to later events. So after signing the treaty, and he did sign it, Francis was set at liberty, although he left his prison with the firm determination not to fulfill the terms imposed by force, which he only subscribed to because it was the only way of getting his freedom. So he would say, I was signed under duress. Though from what I've heard, he said, oh, this is not under duress, but maybe he would have said, I was under duress to say that too. So anyway, in any case, he definitely was not going to give up the Duchy of Burgundy to Charles V. That would have just been unthinkable. So Charles V is growing in his power to such an extent that he's really making a lot of people worried, with the result that Pope Clement VII, King Henry VIII, the republics of Venice, Genoa, Florence, and Milan all entered into an alliance with Francis against him. So he's highly feared at this time. And because the Pope was in on this coalition, it became known as the Holy League. And naturally, Charles V was not going to be too happy with this. And also, it gave rise to essentially making it possible for, what we'll see shortly after here, an army of Lutherans sacking Rome in the name of Charles V. So there were, in Italy, and as I said, a group of mercenary soldiers, German Lutherans called Landsknechts. And the German name isn't terribly important, but these German mercenaries crossed the Alps. They were led by a Lutheran, Georg, or George in English, Freundsberg, who wore about his neck a golden chain, with which, as he said, he meant to strangle the Pope. So they weren't content with other damage that they had just done in Italy in the name of Charles V, like besieging Milan. They want to go for Rome. So they marched through also other areas of Italy, Ferrara and Bologna, and the Lutherans were about to turn into Tuscany, and many were, it says, in the habit of swearing by the glorious sack of Florence. So they amassed quite a bit of booty, which really that's what mercenaries do. That's how they get paid, or at least if they don't get paid, that's what they do. But they, urged on by still lust for still more booty, and also because they're heretics and they hate the Pope, they want to attack Rome, so they move on towards Rome. And this Duke of Bourbon was in on this also. So he fell, this Duke of Bourbon fell in the attack, which you might think would be an advantage to the defenders of the city because he was apparently a very charismatic general. But it actually had the opposite effect, and the attackers were urged on by his loss, with the result that they gave no quarter at all to anybody. And on the very day of their entrance, this author says that 8,000 Romans were butchered while they were imploring mercy on their knees. And certainly it was a very brutal sack of the city. Tombs were broken open, bodies were thrown into rivers, all sorts of things. Plundering, pillaging, looting, certainly raping went on, all kinds of horrible things, yes. In the name of Charles V. Yes, he wouldn't have ordered it, but these were mercenaries on his payroll. And they were in Italy, so they decided to go after Rome. You remember also, speed of communications at the time was such that this could have all happened without Charles V ever hearing about it, which seems to have been the case. But they were in his pay. He hired these German mercenaries to fight for him in Italy, and they ended up doing this horrible sack of Rome. So further descriptions of the sack of Rome. It was not enough for these rapacious plunderers to seize upon the rich stores of sacred and profane wealth, which the piety or industry of the people had gathered into the capital of the Christian world. The wretched inhabitants themselves became the victims of the fierce and brutal soldiery. Those who were suspected of having hidden their wealth were put to the torture. So there's the story of different merchants, rich merchants being tortured till they give up their gold or silver. In one case, I read about a merchant who was some huge amount of money was demanded of him. So he gave it. He managed to scrounge it together, but it was in the form of silver. The soldiers didn't like that it was silver, so they started torturing him again because they wanted it in gold because silver was too heavy. And then he attacked them, personally attacked them, and killed at least one of them before he was killed. But that's the kind of thing we have going on during the sack of Rome. So really horribly ugly. Now, killing was even going on in churches. But again, given the fact that we have Lutherans doing this, it's not particularly surprising that would be the case. Some were forced by those tortures to give promissory notes. In other words, they didn't have money on hand. They had to promise that they would give it in the future, and to drain the purses of their friends in other countries. So some of them managed to get out that way, but then had to call for international financial assistance in order to save their lives. And a number of prelates fell under these sufferings. And that's actually something that would continue in later centuries of revolutionaries killing clergy in Rome. There was one example during the reign of, I believe it was Pius IX, there was a cannon that was brought in by revolutionaries into St. Peter's Square. And there was also a case of a bishop being shot dead at his window. So, not a very edifying thing you'd expect to be hearing about people doing in Rome, but you see, Rome is no stranger to violence. Right? Has never been throughout history a stranger to violence. Many others, after having paid their ransom, while thinking themselves free from further attacks, were forced to redeem themselves again, and consequently died from grief or terror caused by these acts of violence. So sometimes they ransom themselves, and then probably another group of soldiers would make them ransom themselves again. The German troops were seen, these mercenaries, these Lutheran mercenaries, were seen drunk at once with wine and blood, leading about bishops in full pontifical attire, seated on mules, or dragging cardinals through the streets, loading them with blows and outrages. In their eagerness for plunder, they broke in the doors of the tabernacles, and they also destroyed masterpieces of art. The Vatican Library was sacked. The public squares and the churches of Rome were converted into marketplaces, where the conquerors sold, as promiscuous booty, the Roman ladies and horses, and these brutal excesses were committed even in the basilicas of St. Peter and St. Paul, which were even held by the barbarian Alaric, who sacked Rome centuries earlier, as sacred asylums. So barbarians in previous centuries are better than these monsters. And our author points out that the pillage which had happened also of Rome under the barbarian Genseric, who had, as also as I recall comes up quite a bit in the Martyrology, had lasted 14 days, so 2 weeks, but this particular sack lasted 2 months. The wardrobe, even, of the sovereign pontiff fell into the hands of these marauders. Clothed in the sacred vestments, they assembled in the hall of the conclave and proceeded to a mock election. So this is the hatred that Lutheranism inspires in its partisans. So they pretend to depose Pope Clement VII. They supposedly depose him. They solemnly elected, supposedly, the apostate monk Luther as vicar of Jesus Christ, which he seems to have already declared himself anyway, as we've seen earlier. But they went as far as to do that, yes. No, he wasn't. He wasn't there. Like these are people who are in his party, and it's only a very loose idea. Remember, he said that to found sects is stupid. So he's not, at least not yet, hasn't really set up any kind of hierarchy, any kind of system. But he will. We'll see that. But again, at this point, there are people who are certainly animated by him, by his ideas, and they're doing this animated by the spirit of hatred of the church that he's inspired in them. Yes.
Father, what year was the sack?
Let's see. Did I mention that? Again, in the 1520s. I think it's 1526. I have to actually check the date. I thought I included that in here, but it seems I did not. I think I left that out by accident. But actually, I'll get back to you on that. The date of this. I'll have to check it. So again, our author continues that they knew apparently no better way of honoring the author of the Reformation than by conferring upon him in derision a dignity which he had made the chief butt of his ridicule. Yes, you have a question? Yes. These were his mercenaries doing this. Again, it's not certainly he didn't order them directly to do this, but they were on his payroll. So all this was done in his name, or at least by people on his payroll. So it's seen as these were people who were hired by him, and probably as a result of the league which was formed against him, and they were fighting for his interests in Italy, and took advantage of the fact that they were in that country to perpetrate these atrocities. But no, he wouldn't have ordered them to sack Rome. He had problems, but he wouldn't have gone quite that far. So while these scenes of desolation and horror were enacted in Rome, Clement VII was besieged in the Castel Sant'Angelo, which was his last asylum. It was there that he found himself so closely pressed that he was forced to capitulate. So he had to come to terms with these people. And on the 5th of June, 1527, so that's 1527, it appears. Again, I'll still check it just to make sure that this author is correct, that he agrees with others. The Archbishop of Capua, on behalf of the unfortunate pontiff, signed a treaty by which Clement was bound to pay 100,000 gold ducats to place the castle of Sant'Angelo as a pledge in the hands of the emperor's officers, to give up to the imperialists the cities of Ostia, Civitavecchia, the Città di Castello, Parma, and Piacenza, so various cities throughout Italy, to remain a prisoner until the promised sum should have been paid. So Clement found it impossible to fulfill those conditions. The governors refused to give up the cities placed in their charge. The pontifical treasury was completely drained, and the Pope was forced to remain a prisoner. A fearful plague crowned this series of disasters, and one of the things to which it has been attributed was the fact that these marauders broke into tombs in the city, tombs in various churches, and scattered the dead bodies everywhere. That's attributed to having spread to that's attributed with having spread to some extent this plague, which was an actually serious thing that killed a lot of people all at once. Didn't just attack certain age ranges, and you had less than a 99% chance of surviving it. This was a serious plague. And yeah, that one of the things that attributed to it. It even came to the Castle Sant'Angelo, so people in the castle itself, where the Pope was hiding from these marauders, were infected by it. So the Pope himself was exposed to the danger of this scourge, which is, of course, more deadly than war. In fact, that's very common. Wars, at least wars in past centuries, it was very common that there would be more deaths among the soldiery from illnesses of various kinds than there were from actual wounds in battle, or deaths in battle, or deaths from wounds sustained in battle. Certainly in the U.S. Civil War, that was the case. That there were more deaths of illness in camp than there were deaths on the battlefield, or even as a result of wounds sustained in battle. So in past centuries, that is not an uncommon thing. So this is worse than all of the, at least in terms of human casualties, is worse than the sack, the violence perpetrated during the sack of Rome, the plague which followed upon it. So he managed to escape from his prison in the disguise of a traveling merchant. So not the only time that a pope has had to take flight in disguise. There are other instances of that. Everything at once seemed to conspire against the pontiff. So, and then of course, remember that this is a Medici pope who we're dealing with. So, Medici is one of the families who's very much involved in Italian politics. So, there are enemies, they have political enemies. And this moment of weakness, the enemies of the Medici seized the occasion offered by the confusion of the moment to drive out the family of the Pope from Florence. So everything is going against Pope Clement VII right now. But of course, all of this means that for Charles V, everything is, politically anyway, is looking up. His power was in fact at its zenith at this time. Beside the provinces of the German Empire, he ruled the Italian peninsula from the Alps to the Mediterranean. On the 24th of February, 1530, the Pope would actually crown him emperor at Bologna. But Clement, of course, at this time we're looking at right now, could not look with indifference upon the rapid growth of the imperial sway, which threatened to destroy the balance of power in Europe. Of course, our author says that he was also afraid of injury to the interests of the church, which is not entirely implausible given the fact that, as we just saw, his mercenaries sacked Rome, and so he was willing to hire people who would do that. But again, our author also does like to whitewash to some degree, so there is almost certainly some degree of just political interest on the part of Clement VII, which contributed to his opposition to Charles V. Because also the Habsburgs are very powerful at this time. and Charles V was a Habsburg. So that was not something that a Medici looked upon with pleasure. So now I'll turn back to Lutheran politics and events. While the Catholic princes we saw earlier were forming their league at Ratisbon, a meeting of Lutheran princes was held at Torgau in 1526. So these are the bad ones, the ones I mentioned earlier who were coming together for their own interests in support of Luther. Philip, the Landgrave of Hesse, who will become famous for other reasons later on, and John, the new elector of Saxony, the duchies of Mecklenburg and Anhalt in Prussia, the cities of Brunswick and Magdeburg, entered into an alliance to support the cause of the Reform. So now we're seeing Luther's principles leading to consequences, some of which, anyway, their author would have wished to disavow. Some of which we've already seen in the program of Karlstadt at Wittenberg, the attacks he was carrying out against the Mass in that place. Again, it's not to say that Luther didn't want the Mass to be attacked, but the extent to which Karlstadt was going was too much for Luther. But again, Karlstadt wouldn't listen to him because this is a revolution we're having here. Why should one revolutionary bow to another? So again, this fanatical preacher with his own hand set fire to the textbooks brought to him by students from all quarters under pretext that the Bible must henceforth furnish the only reading for all mankind. Yes. So, whether that, of course, that probably wouldn't include his own writings and his own ideas on sacred scripture, which, of course, are external to sacred scripture. Of course, that idea of scripture alone is nowhere to be found in it. The people applauded these disgraceful scenes and followed the sectary to the plunder of churches and monasteries. Similar scenes were enacted at Zwickau by a band of fanatics who rejected the authority of Luther, thus putting into practice the theories of independence which they had learned from the Saxon monk himself by throwing off the yoke he sought to impose upon them. So, makes perfect sense. This trend will not stop. We'll see. They denied the validity of infant baptism, for which they said they could find no warrant in Scripture. So their personal inspiration didn't tell them that should be done. Their leader took them to Wittenberg, where he maintained his doctrine that infant baptism was useless, that hence it was indispensably necessary to rebaptize adults, upon whom the Church could not confer a valid sacrament before they had attained the age of reason. Their doctrine obtained for them the name of Anabaptists, to which their disorders gave a most bloody renown. So now we have the Anabaptists, offshoot of Lutheranism. So even Melanchthon, or Black Earth, Mr. Black Earth, in Greek, that's what that means, Luther's cherished disciple, wavered for some time between the authority of his master and that of the new sectaries. So he was thinking about going in that direction. Okay, we'll come back to this later. And I will check that date for the sack of Rome and get back to you tomorrow on that. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen, sub tuum residium confugimus sancta Dei genitrix nostras deprecationes et dispicias, in necessitatibus et a periculis cunctis libera nos semper, Virgo gloriosa et benedicta. In nomine Patris et Filii et Spiritus Sancti, amen.